Cambridge Muslim College, training the next generation of Muslim thinkers.
So I will talk between 45 minutes, an hour, depending on... I could talk forever about this subject because this is a passion project about Robert Reschid Stanley, who was my three greats grandfather. So I'm going to give the credit first of all to my dad, because it was my dad that made this discovery. And it was an incredible discovery in more ways than one, which some of you might already know, but I won't give you any spoilers as to why it's a very, very personal family history story for all of us. So my dad researched the facts. If you're into your family history, you do your birth, your marriages, your deaths. They're usually the certificates that you can get hold of first. And I've gone a lot deeper, if you like, into the subject. My auntie is also a very passionate genealogist who's been a fantastic source of help. So I don't want to take the credit for all the work that they've did, but I took it, I guess, to the next level, and I did 2 books when I was only meant to write 1. I did get a bit carried away with things. So without further ado, I will talk about Robert. There's only 3 photographs that we have in existence of Robert, and I've called it radical, regressive or rogue, because those were all accusations levied against him at some point or another. He was born 1828, 10 years before Queen Victoria, just to put it into context. And I'll do a lot of that throughout this talk, because I don't want to presume that you know anything about this particular era of British history. If you do, I'm really sorry. I don't mean to patronise you. You probably know a lot more than I do anyway. But I wanted to tell you why. I'm going to keep trying to put reference points out of the air and say, drive my children mad because I keep going, 1848, that's the year when Robert did this. And, not that again. So he died in 1911. He was a very, very old man for his times and lived an incredible life. Most of this talk, I will be talking about the years before he became a Muslim, not because that's any more important than the years that he lived his life as a Muslim in Britain, but because he was 69 when he converted. So he had 69 years without being a Muslim, as you want to call it. And this is the beautiful text that a friend of mine, who's an Islamic calligrapher, Razwan, wrote for me. And that's the opening bit to the story, really. So it all begins with family history. It begins with my dad being made redundant. My dad was a lorry mechanic, and he was quite pleased to be made redundant, unlike most people, because he'd worked a long time, and he at last could throw himself into his family history. And so he let the word be known in our family that he was researching the life of Robert Stanley, his great-great-grandfather, who we were very proud to say had been a mayor of Stalybridge. From a working class family in Stalybridge, that's dead important. So that was the first thing he wanted to find out. And an elderly relative said, I've got something of Robert's. And he presented Dad with a very, very faded, tattered copy of a magazine called The Crescent. And in that magazine was a photograph of Robert. And there was an interview with the person that wrote this magazine, who was called Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, never heard of him. And it was April 1907. So my dad remained extremely clueless as to why his great-great-granddad had been featured in such a strange-looking magazine. And this is the actual edition that we have at home. But the other really peculiar thing for our family was Robert was wearing a fez. Now, if you're from my generation, fez only means one thing, which is Tommy Cooper. So the first thing that my dad wondered was, why on earth was he wearing a fez? But Daddy's still quite an intelligent guy, and he thought there's something more to it than just an eccentric, strange, religious thing going on here, because my brother had converted to Islam 10 years before. So my brother converted, he's nearly been a Muslim now for nearly 30 years. So, of course, my dad recognised the fact that there was something a little bit unusual going on here. The words underneath the photograph of Robert said, in the words of Quilliam, this is a distinguished British Mussulman. Now, again, never heard of that term, Mussulman. And my brother instantly knew what that meant, and he instantly realised, well, you can imagine the significance for him. This is 1990. You didn't get that many white converts in East Manchester from working class backgrounds wandering around, as he did, thinking, I'm the only person I know who's ever done this. But his own great-great-great-grandfather had made that journey before him. This is a wonderful photograph. There's Robert with his fez. Now, the next thing that happened, again, wow, what a moment. Another elderly relative said, that Robert Stanley that you've been doing the research into, I've got something of his, would you like to have it? And it turned out that this is what it was. I'll just take it forward a bit. a fez. The actual fez from that photograph, which we still have under lock and key, the most precious item in our family now. Somebody had kept the fez, knowing that it belonged to this Robert, not knowing the significance of it, not knowing that he was a Muslim. What are the chances of that? That was quite incredible. The next discovery, again, you know, we're from a very humble place in the north of England. We don't have huge caches of jewellery, but my granny died shortly after this discovery was made. And in a jewellery box, she had a little tiny pin. And we suddenly realised my dad knew about this pin. It belonged to his granddad. And his great-granddad had handed it down to Granny, direct descendant. And it's Star and Crescent of Islam. A friend of ours, Yahya Burt, who's done a lot of research, who we're doing quite a bit of work with, instantly said that's something from the Liverpool Muslim Institute. We're not exactly sure who it came from and how it got into his hands, but again, that's quite a significant discovery. But I'll just leap backwards again to the family tree so you can see the connection here. There's the most important person is obviously me and my brother. Of course, it's our generation. My daughter's upstairs, so she'll probably tell you that no, it's the next generation down that are the most important. But you can see there through the red font, that's the direct lineage right up to Robert Reschid Stanley at the top. I remember my great-grandpa, who died age 91, I think it was, and obviously he was the grandson of Robert Reschid. So there is some kind of a nice connection there that I'm able to talk about and to remember. But again, we didn't know this story when Grampy was alive. We only found out about it shortly before my granny died, which is why I'm not a Stanley, which is why I'm a Longden, because obviously if you're a woman, you have to change your name. Certainly in those days you did anyway. So the next bit was, I'm going to write a book about this because my brother decided that he didn't write books. I wrote books in the family, so I was going to be the one tasked with this. History is my background and history has always been my interest as well. So the first picture you can see there of the dusty old book, that was my next step, because I will bore you to death about this throughout this talk, but if you're from a working class family, it is a million times harder to do research because records are not kept. People didn't sit at home writing diaries about their innermost feelings and experiences and the wonderful people that they met. We just didn't do that, certainly not in the North Mill towns of England. So even though Robert, spectacular man that he was, never kept a diary that we know of, there are no letters, there is nothing. The only thing that I could go back to and get was the council books, the minutes. So Britain had just decided to set up the municipalities, the boroughs. Stalybridge was the borough that he was a mayor of, and it was a very new borough, it was a very new town. But they kept wonderful records and wonderful minutes, and ploughing through all these minutes of incredibly dull things about sewage systems, I found at last his handwriting. So that probably sounds like nothing to you, but to me that was quite a moment to see his own hand. And it looked as well that he'd written his own minutes, which probably isn't the best thing to do when you're looking at governance, but that is in the book, and I'll perhaps talk a little bit more about that later on in questions. So he was born 1828 in Cardiff. Again, I talk about that a lot more in the book as to why he was born in Cardiff. He was one of 9, but the family were all from Ashton, Stalybridge area. For those of you who've never been to God's own country, which is Yorkshire, so I've defected. I'm a Lancashire lass, but I now live in Yorkshire, literally 5-10 miles. There's nothing in it. Wars have been fought over this, so I have to be very careful what I say at this point. But there's a map of the north of England, which is our town, our areas. We all still live up there. Nobody's moved. And that's the map that Robert would have been a little bit more savvy with in terms of the knowledge. But that's Greater Manchester area. Greater Manchester area here. You can see on the east side there, Tameside it's called now, but Ashton-under-Lyne is where the action begins. Right next door to that, not on the map, is Stalybridge, where the rest of the history continues. Now the Christian Israelites, I imagine most of you have not heard of, and they feature a lot, to the point that I wrote so much I had to put it into an appendix because it was getting quite ridiculous. But I found that a fascinating part of Robert's journey. We didn't know anything about this until my dad, and this is the beauty of family history research in Britain, Dad got hold of the marriage certificate of Robert. Robert got married at the age of 19, and it says the place that you got married. And on this marriage certificate, it said he got married in the sanctuary of the Christian Israelites in Ashton-under-Lyne. Now, not everybody, but an awful lot of people who live in Ashton, Stalybridge, Duckingfield area know about the Christian Israelites. They were across Britain, they were scattered across Britain, but they were basically founded by a man called Prophet John Rowe. who was from a wool combing family in Bradford, not far away, just half day's journey away really, on a horse. He was the successor to a woman called Joanna Southcott. This was at a time, we're really talking about the tail end of the 18th century, when there were quite a lot of female religious leaders of Christian sects. Now, Joanna was one of them, and she was quite well known. She had visions, she had prophecies, she wrote them down. She had a lot of followers in the country, and they were millennialists. I always find that so difficult to say. So they believed that Christ had yet to return, and they were preparing because Christ was going to return in their lifetime. So they were making physical preparations for the birth of a child. When Joanna died, there were a lot of guys that wanted that title of taking over the Southcottians. And again, you know, there are various reasons for this, but there were very, very few religious leaders who were female at this time. The person that came through, fought off the contest of his contestants, was John Roe, a very fascinating character. And that is the only image that we have of John Roe on his humble mule there. He insisted that everybody followed Mother Joanna. She was called Mother Joanna's rule, but he also wanted a return to Mosaic law. So all the Christian Israelites across the land who did now decided to follow him were following Mosaic law. All the men had to wear beards. Now, this was at a time when beards was incredibly uncool. You did not wear a beard until after the Crimean War in the 1850s. So to wear a beard was quite an embarrassing thing in those days, but he insisted on Old Testament rule. And they were actually known locally as the beardies, as a vague insult for them there. The women and the men all had to follow the clothing rules of the Old Testament, so the seams and certain colours. Women had to wear certain colours. Everybody had to eat kosher, and all the males had to be circumcised. So very, very close to Judaism, really. The other thing, which is just fantastic, and it's hard to get your head around this, but Ashton-under-Lyne, that Lancashire cotton town mill, was the New Jerusalem. This is where Christ was going to reappear. This is what they believed fervently. And John Roe believed it so much that he wanted to build the New Jerusalem. So he started building gatehouses, 4 gatehouses at each corner of the New Jerusalem, and started creating a wall between them. I'm not quite sure what the other people of Ashton thought about this. I'd imagine they just thought it was a strange thing, and they kind of just let him get on with it, really. That's one of the gatehouses that still exists today. It's a pub, and they decided to call the pub the Odd Whim. I'm not quite sure why. Now, the money for all of this building, the money was put up by the richest men of Ashton-under-Lyne. And the richest men of Ashton-under-Lyne at this time, this is the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So this is cotton. This is the money from cotton that we're talking about. John Stanley was the uncle of Robert Stanley. So little Robert Stanley was born in Cardiff. His mum and dad had no money. The economy was crashing at the time. And he was sent back to live with Uncle John, who had made a fortune. So this is a really poor working class family. Uncle John suddenly made a fortune from iron, from building all the machinery, because the people were herded into the factories at this point. Before that, it'd always been cottage industry, spinning your cotton, producing it by hand loom weavers. But now we're talking about the beginning of capitalism and getting people into the factories. And John Stanley made those machines, and that's how he made his money. And the prophet decided the best way to get his church up and running is to make friends, basically, with the richest men. Often the way to start off a new religion is to target really the people with the money and to bring them into your churches. And John Stanley, by everything that I've read about him, was a really good man. Some of the stuff that he did was amazing. He was incredibly kind and incredibly generous from the written records that we've got access to on him. And I should say as well that the Christian Israelite Church still exists. There's a branch in Australia and there's a branch in California. And the Australian branch were really helpful in this research. They take their history of their church really very seriously indeed. And they've just been a great source of help accessing John Roe's diaries. Now, Uncle John Stanley, rich Uncle John, as I like to call him in the book, was married to a woman called Sarah Stanley. And one of the things that I found fascinating in this research, having access to John Roe's diaries. Now, John Roe was not literate. He got somebody else to write his visions down in his diaries. And he railed against Sarah Stanley. He really did not like this woman. And I wondered why that was, because I'm particularly interested, because it's so difficult to get the lives of women. I'll talk about this a lot. Trying to get hold of the lives of women at this point in time is just almost impossible. But he really took a dislike to her. And I can only presume that they didn't get on because basically she'd funded this church. This was her children's inheritance, nigh on £1 million in today's price had gone into building these buildings. And Uncle John Stanley basically built the sanctuary, which was a massive, massive sanctuary. Again, very Jewish in the way that it was built, in the symbols, the Star of David, in the centre of Ashton-under-Lyne, and that was £750,000 at that cost, Uncle John Stanley, in today's prices. So towards the tail end of this, Robert was still in Cardiff, 2 or 3 years old, when the 7 Virgins scandal happened. Now, some of you might have heard of this. It was made into a BBC TV dramatisation in the 90s, Mr. Rose Virgins it was called, when he was accused of sexual impropriety with 2 women. He'd taken 7 young women to be his handmaidens, essentially, and they were glorified servants. And he was accused of sexual impropriety with 2 of them. The other 5 said that nothing had happened, and the other 2 had made it up because he'd caught one of them stealing, so she sort of lobbied accusations at him. So I haven't tried to make any decision at all on that. I've tried to look at the evidence for what it is, really. And I do feel very much, having got to know, not in great detail, but some of the feelings of the Christian Israelite Church in Australia, and reading all the newspaper reports at the time, any historian that's ever touched on this before have just basically taken it at face value. And the phrase fake news was going through my head a lot as I'm reading the newspaper reports from the 1830s. Very, very detailed, much more detailed for a very buttoned down conservative Victorian society, the kind of stuff that the newspapers reporting on. It just reminded me of a verse from the Bible, from the Old Testament, which is gossip is so tasty, we all love to swallow it. And I think, this man was accused of stuff, whether he did or didn't do it, everybody believed that he had done. And because of that, these people who were already in a religious minority were really targeted by local people. So much so that on 2 occasions, when Rowe was preaching in the middle of this scandal and the newspapers reporting it, people attacked the church. They smashed the church up, which everything was made of silver and brass. Everything was trashed. The people were beaten up. John Rowe was nearly murdered twice. And he actually wrote in his diaries that he was only saved by rich Uncle John Stanley, who must have been fantastic at disaster preparations because he built 2 secret tunnels under the bottom of the sanctuary, under the road, and to his mansion on the other side of it. How's that for preparation? And this just sounds crazy, doesn't it? This just sounds like this could never have happened. But in the 1960s, when they were digging up that road to build a lovely dual carriageway through the centre of Ashton, 2 tunnels were found underneath the road. So it happened. The truth is stranger than fiction, as they say. Robert came to Ashton at this point. He was 10 years old. No formal schooling for children then. He was set to work as an apprentice for rich Uncle John, who was doing the family a favour, and he worked in Uncle John's Christian Israelite shop. As well as owning lots of factories, John owned 2 shops, so he would have been selling kosher food to the Christian Israelites of Ashton. Quite an unusual childhood in many ways. This is a photograph of later 19th century Statler Bridge. You can only imagine what it would have been like living in those times. It really was a stimulus for Marx and Engels. They went around Manchester a lot. Over from Germany, lived here, and they studied these towns. The birthplace of the Industrial Revolution was Statler Bridge. The first steam-powered mill was in Statler Bridge. And this is what Engels said about Statler Bridge at the time. Multitudes of courts, brick lanes, back lanes, and remote nooks arise out of the confused way of buildings. Added to this, the shocking filth and the repulsive effect of Statler Bridge, in spite of its pretty surroundings, may be readily imagined. So he wasn't too impressed. And from that he wrote the condition of the English working class in England and the Communist Manifesto. It was a really, really radical and a really turbulent place to live at this time in history. And I knew a little bit about it before from a history degree because everyone kept telling me, you come from a really interesting place. When you're growing up, where you live's really boring, isn't it? But I finally began to think, actually, wow, some amazing stuff happened here. Robert married his Emma in 1848. He was 19 and they were together for 54 years. He was a grocer. Now he's 19 years old and he sets himself up as a grocer in nearby Statler Bridge. How does he do that when he's a poor working class lad? He's got a rich uncle who's very kind and generous. There's nothing written down to prove this, but again, it's a theory. We've got evidence that John did that for other people, so I think he probably did that for Robert. So Robert set himself up as a grocer and as a tea trader, and that, I think, is where this all begins. He would have been on that train line from Stalybridge to Manchester 2 or 3 times a week getting his tea from the Corn Exchange, which sold everything from around the world, sugar, tea, coffee, you name it, in the Manchester Old Corn Exchange. Then he would have been exposed to a very different set of people than the ones that he was used to in Stalybridge. You didn't get anybody foreign in Stalybridge at this time. If you wanted to meet foreigners, you'd go into Manchester, and that's exactly what Robert was doing professionally. Now, again, just to set this in historical context, we had Peterloo in 1819 in Manchester. So all of Robert's neighbours would have remembered this. Stalybridge Brass Band played at Peterloo. It marched the people down the main street, the long road into Manchester. It was fresh in their minds what had happened at Peterloo. And they had something called the Plug Riots, or otherwise known as the General Strike, in 1842. Again, this is a history of the trade unionism movement just beginning, and it was crushed by the government. Unions were outlawed. The last thing you wanted was to give workers their rights. So instead, the plug riots happened. So the workers went into the factories and yanked the plugs. So the steam engines had to stop, and production had to stop. And this was really radical. This is after Luddism. This is after they were smashing the machinery up. You would get hanged. It was a capital offence to smash up machinery, so they would yank the plugs instead. They were very clever. And the 1840s, we also had Chartism. So Chartism would basically, it was a list of demands from people who wanted universal suffrage, votes for working people, votes for women as well. It was quite radical, but they tended to forget that once the men got the votes, they started thinking about other things. But the Chartist demands was for fairness, it was for democracy, and it was sweeping the continent. The 1848, the year that Robert bought his shop and came to Stalybridge, there was revolution across the entire continent, but not in Britain, probably because of people like Robert, which I'll go on to again in a minute. But factory reform, again, was the big issue of the day. It was just horrific. The life in the factories for people, and lots of these people just they could remember the home industries, the cottage industries, where families would work together. Usually the wife would be spinning the cotton and the man would be working away on the hand loom. But now they were all broken up. The children didn't go to school. From the ages of 5, they were locked in a 14, 15-hour day, down coal mines or in the factories. It was all coal mines and factories at this point where Robert lived. And the anti-poor law movement was massive as well, because the poor law was a new law from the government which basically herded people into the workhouse. I'm sure you all know the story of Oliver Twist. Charles Dickens was appalled by this system. He was completely against it. The men were separated from the women. Anybody that couldn't be looked after by their own families were herded into the workhouse in the most appalling conditions. Sorry, that picture there, that's the Riot Act being read in Ashton, and this happened a lot at this time in history. So what I think, having looked at the whole context of what was going on in Robert's young childhood years, but also as a young man, I think he would have had 2 very extremes of Christian behaviour looking back over his life. One of them is a person that I've been really interested in recent years, a man called Reverend Joseph Rayner Stevens. When I went to university, I had not heard of this guy, and my professor, oh, that's where Joseph Rayner Stevens was from, he was amazing. Didn't know who he was, and for my sins I do now. He was an incredible man, and here's a photograph of him. He was a minister, a Methodist minister, and he was the biggest name really in Britain against factory reform and the disgraceful treatment of children, and he pushed for the 10-hour act so that kids would only have to work for 10 hours. He was also known as a Chartist, even though he always said, well, you know, I agree with what you want, but that's not what I'm about. I'm about trying to build a better life, you know, to bring glory to God and to raise the poor from the suffering. And he was absolutely against the poor law. He was just the darling of the working class person, so much so that the year that Robert had been living in Ashton for 2 years, and Joseph Rayner Stevens was sent to prison for sedition for 18 months because he'd gone to an illegal meeting Sounds very much similar today. You have to organise and apply to have a meeting. If you want to protest against the government, he went to an illegal meeting and he was accused of inciting violent behaviour by saying something along the lines of, if I were you, I'd take up arms against the government. So he went to prison for 18 months and then he was bound over for 5 years not to speak in public, which must have been hard for a man whose average sermon was 5 hours at a time. Even when he was pleading his case in court, his speech was 3 hours long. He was quite an amazing person. But something else that I found out about the area, which was of great interest to me, there's a nice pic of a poor little boy working in the cotton factories there with the bobbins. This is an actual photograph of the workhouse. This is one of the male sides of the workhouse. This is the Battle of the Two St Georges. And again, this was in all the national newspapers at the time. This is the year really that Robert arrived in Stalybridge, and this is what he was faced with. You can see up there, that's the Whit Walks, the Whit Float up there. Up in the top right-hand corner is an octagonal faced church. That's the original parish church, the Christian Church of Stalybridge. And then a few years later, they decided to build another one called St George's. Two St George's, it's going to kick off, isn't it? And that's exactly what happened, because the minister of the first one decided he wanted to go to the nice new church, but nobody wanted to go to the nice new church. And at that time, churches only existed on a pew rent system. So a family would rent a pew, but nobody was wanting to go to the new church. So all of a sudden he thought, I'm getting no money here, I should want to go back to the old church. But they didn't want him back at the old church. So there was literally a battle every day for 2 years. Thousands of local people would turn up to the graveyard of the old St George's, as every morning the vicar from the new St George's would parade up to the church, demand to be able to say prayers there, and the wardens locked him out. So there was a lot of doors being kicked down. One of the wardens had a gun, and there was no TV in those days, but there was a great battle going on in the church every day. And this turned out to be the church that Robert decided to go to, the octagonal one there, the original old St George's Church. But I guess looking back at his life, you know, this was discussed in Parliament, what was going on in the Church of England up in Stalybridge at this time. It must have been a strange time to be worshipping at a Christian church, which again, later on he did accuse of hypocrisy. But the other context that I found particularly interesting, this is something I wasn't taught about at school. None of my generation in Lancashire were taught about the Lancashire cotton famine. My parents tell me that they weren't taught about it. Certainly kids today are not taught about it unless I'm telling them about it at school. And this happened in Stalybridge and Ashton. The bread riots happened, which were an absolute, well, I'll show you a picture in a minute, but it was astounding. And this was all a result of the Lancashire cotton famine. Now, the Lancashire cotton famine was something that came to my attention when I was doing research into Robert, because I didn't use the newfangled way of doing research, which is typing someone's name on the British newspaper archives, and you get, lo and behold, 10 pages on them, because the newspapers from this part of the world are not yet digitised. So if you want to research into these people, you know, the centre of the world, clearly, the northwest of England, unfortunately you have to go back to microfiche. So you have to get the old-fashioned tapes and sit there. So I sat day after day, hour after hour, just scanning thousands of pages for the name Robert Stanley. And it really did ruin my eyesight, but it was worth it because stuff sprang out at me and I was able to piece things together. And I found Robert Stanley, a young man, still a young man, in 1863, chairing a meeting of 600 people who had met to discuss the American Civil War, like you do. And again, they just discussed it. Robert chaired it, and they were trying to has it gone on for long enough? Should we still be supporting Lincoln? And the problem was, Lincoln needed to break the economic might of the South. The South was clearly built on cotton. The cotton might was built on the back of African slaves who just arrived from Africa. And Lincoln knew that the only way to win the war was to break the might of the South. So he blockaded the cotton. What did Manchester rely on? Cotton. Manchester was known as King Cotton. You didn't even say Manchester. You said the words King Cotton. Everybody knew which part of the world you were talking about. And unfortunately, that meant the factories had to shut down. So during the period 1861 to 63, 4/5 of the factories were closed. It was mass unemployment. It was called the Great Panic. People fled from these towns. They were like ghost towns, a lot of them. Stalybridge and Ashton were so badly affected by this that the poor law, which was meant to pay a few pennies to people who were struggling and who were unemployed, couldn't cope. And Manchester said, right, we can't pay, we can't give anything more to these people of Stalybridge and Ashton. The unemployment is so high, we're going to go to a ticketed system. So they would give tickets to people. Again, these things seem to come around in circular. I won't go into any politics, but these things happen again and again in history. And the people were appalled that if they wanted bread, they had to take a ticket to a shop. And they knew that this was because authority felt that they couldn't trust them not to buy beer or to buy stupid things. But they also had to wear cast-off clothes, and the cast-off clothes would also have tickets on the outside that said it was poor law. So it was indignity after indignity. If you didn't walk around saying you were poor on your arm, you had to go and get a loaf of bread for a ticket, or you'd be in the workhouse. So they basically had a riot, and the riots were the bread riots. Now, this is an amazing picture because my dad found this, and my dad keeps doing this. He keeps saying, no, there's nothing else on Robert, we don't have anything, and then he pulls out this newspaper. This belonged to Robert, apparently. And I said, well, what is it? And we didn't have photographs in those days. It was an illustration. This is the main street. You can even see the new St George's up at the top there. This is the main street of Stalybridge. And this is the bread riot in Stalybridge, when the people just went crazy. They'd had enough. They started looting the shops. And we thought, wow, that's fantastic. And of course, Robert, unfortunately, hadn't written, dear great-great-great-granddaughter, this is a great piece, this actually happened, and just a newspaper. So I had to put two and two together. And the beautiful thing about the British census, for any of you here, if you've had relatives living in England, every 10 years we have this census. Now you might wonder what's the point in that, but it is wonderful. I could actually go back to 1861 and see where Robert was living at the time. And this is what I did. So this is a photograph of my dad and my son outside Robert's shop. And you can see it's the one here on the left that's being trashed. And that's the only memory we have that Robert told my grampy. There was this thing called the bread riots, and I had to throw bread out the windows to stop people from smashing up the place any more than they already were. That's his actual shop. Now, if we'd not had the census, we wouldn't have been able to find which the shop was. And the strange find of this picture that he'd clearly left, you know, we didn't have Facebook, people putting their dinners online for us all to see. It was just some random newspaper in the loft that we happened to have. And you can even see the words tea there above his shop. So that it was just incredible to find that. So he lived through this, he saw his shop being trashed. Now you might well think that would turn him into somebody that really hated the kind of people that would trash his shops. But no, because the next thing that happened after the bread riots was the anti-Irish Catholic Murphy riots, 1869, a few years later. Something that absolutely astonished me. Now, I always knew there was a little bit of sectarianism going on in the towns of Ashton, Stalybridge, Oldham, but I never realised just how protracted it was, because during the 1860s, just in a matter of a decade, because of the failure of the potato crop, the population became 48% newly arrived Irish immigrants. 48%. The town changed like that within a decade. Now, the people in that illustration there were primarily young Irish people who just were starving to death. And there was a lot of anti-Irish Catholic feeling at the time. And a really unpleasant character called Murphy decided to tour the country, giving talks about how evil Catholicism was. He even did a strange little play about how Irish Catholic priests were preying on young women. And it was just horrific. So you've got the Orange men fighting the Irish nationalists. Obviously, Home Rule for Ireland is a big issue as well at the time. So these riots occurred across the country, Birmingham, Wolverhampton, and particularly in the north of England in Ashton and Stalybridge. This was all on Robert's doorstep. He saw all of this unfolding on these streets. That very year of the bread riots, he was elected councillor. Again, we've got nothing other than basic council minutes, Councillor Robert Stanley elected. No whys, no wherefores. I can only conclude that having seen what went on with the bread riots, he was probably perceived to be a person who was very level-headed, and he was elected a councillor. And the next thing, he's a working class man who's been elected a magistrate. Until this point, every single councillor in these towns were the wealthiest people. They were all living in mansions, they were all owning factories, and then there's Robert the grocer. And now he's a magistrate. It just didn't really seem to make any sense. The other thing which causes a lot of laughter in our family, because we're very political, is that Robert was elected a Conservative councillor. And for a lot of people, that doesn't add up. But if you look at the politics at the time, there were two main parties. The Conservatives were, in the main, the party of the working classes. The other party, the Liberals, were the party of the rich factory owners. And you know, that's making it in quite simplistic terms. But Robert was of the feeling that the Conservatives represented the working class people. When he was a magistrate, again in his own man book, I've written an awful lot about the cases. I had to go through his cases through the local newspapers, which was a horrendous thing to do. But wow, it was amazing because I heard his voice. Because the newspapers in those days reported it exactly as the court stenographer would. So I hear what Robert's saying to the person. And the thing that I noticed time and time again, I knew the names of all the other magistrates on the bench with him, and they were all the rich men of the town. He was introduced a system of either or. So he would say to somebody, okay, you know, you've committed a crime, you can either take a fine or go to prison. And nobody else was doing this. And that just made me think he was really interested in the concept of justice, of giving people some choice. And another one that sprang out at me, I'm going to talk about this a lot with regards to women, you only ever heard about women in these newspapers. If you were Queen Victoria, they'd write about you, or maybe if you were an opera singer, you might get an odd mention. Or if you were a drunken woman, and there were a lot of drunken women. And the headline that constantly appeared was more drunken women in court, more drunken women in court. And these really judgmental, horrible editorials by the newspaper owners about these women. And time again, Robert's dealing with them and trying to get them to swear off the booze. But there's a beautiful, beautiful example of the way that he gave mercy to people, to women in particular, and the suffering that women were going through. He must have seen some horrific stuff. In 1872, we had the Education Act, so the new school boards were included. So children under the age of 10 had to go to school. Robert was one of the first trustees on the school board, and he had some really interesting views on educating working class people as well. And this is where it all began for me. I started thinking, this man is really interested in education, is really interested in working class people having access to something which they'd never had access to before. And thanks to Quilliam, going right back to the beginning of the talk and that presentation of that interview of Quilliam's with Robert, we know that Robert went to Parliament in 1869. And I went down to the archives in Parliament, even though you can access the archives online. I wanted to go and see them there. And that was fantastic because I could I got to hear his words for the first time ever after the court's writing. He answered hundreds of questions, and it was a select committee on whether the secret ballot should be introduced in England. Because until this point in time, if you had the vote, you were rich, and you were certainly male. The only working class people that had the vote were the ones that owned property. So very, very few of them did. But some of them did for whatever reasons, and they worked in the factories. So they had to go out in front of the entire town, cast their vote on a big blackboard with an X. They had to say, are you voting Liberal or are you voting Conservative? Now bear in mind that most of the mill owners in Stalybridge and Ashton were Liberals, and their mates were going up for either being a Liberal councillor or being the Liberal MP. So there was bribery going on, and there was the treating system, and the treating system Robert talks about in great detail. The treating system was when somebody would be treated by the factory owner's mates, get them drunk down the pub. If you vote for our man, next week we'll take you down and get you drunk again. That's what was going on. Or they were getting beaten up, but most of the time they were just getting sacked. If you got sacked, really not a particularly great thing to happen to you when you've got a family of 10 to feed. So Robert said in his own very kind of, they dug. They were kind of trying to say to him, what is your experience? And he was basically saying, as a magistrate, this is what I found. And they got out of him that he set up an association called the Anti-Screw Association. And in a way, it was a form of a trade union. He was getting working men who agreed that nobody should be bribed. They should vote the way that they want to vote. There should be no pressure on you. So they would pay a penny in. So when it came to election time and the person was invariably beaten up, disabled or sacked, they'd get a payout until they could actually find a job again. That was just incredible to think that he'd set this up and he was working this. And the committee, the select committee that interviewed him, he says in his interview with Quilliam, they were so impressed. And, the Foreign Secretary came over and shook my hand. And these were all the big people of government. Half of them were cabinet ministers, Gladstone's cabinet ministers. And ironically, Robert couldn't stand Gladstone. Gladstone was a Liberal. But that must have been an incredible experience. But the one thing that I got out of going to the archives in London in particular, in the archives, there's a list of what expenses were paid for the people that travelled to give evidence. And everybody was making their claim, but also saying what the titles were. So it was Major this, and it was Councillor this, and it was Mayor this. And Robert could have put Councillor Stanley, Magistrate Stanley, and he just put Robert Stanley Grocer. And I just thought that was fantastic. He either felt that he didn't need to, or was trying to make a point. And I think he was basically saying, my views on the secret ballot are here from my meetings every day with ordinary people and what I see and what I hear, not because I've achieved this title. He seemed to be an extremely humble person. And then he was made mayor, 1874. And until this point, bear in mind that all the local newspapers, they were all Liberal owned. They'd never had a bad word said against him. They always said, well, if push comes to shove and we end up with a mayor, Robert Stanley's the best. But 1874, the government changed to becoming a Tory government nationally. They weren't very happy. So they said that, well, they were outraged actually that Robert had become mayor. They said he wasn't old enough, he wasn't fat enough, and he wasn't bald enough to be a mayor. Which I think, if that's the worst thing you can say about somebody, you're not doing too badly. I imagine he probably would have found that quite amusing. But he was the first working class mayor. Everybody else was loaded, basically. But he obviously knew his information extremely well, and he never went to school. And this is a thing you have to keep reminding yourself. He was so well educated. His letters were fantastic. Well, there are some examples of his letters in the Crescent. How did he do that? He couldn't afford an education. He never went to school. He was an avid reader, and he was also a municipal socialist. And I won't bore you to death with what municipal socialism was or is, but it wasn't socialism as we know it. It was just basically a way of enforcing better public health system. So it was introducing baths, it was introducing libraries, it was introducing clean market halls. In the middle there's a picture of the Victorian Market Hall. Robert was only a councillor, and he was appointed to head up the building of the first market hall. Parks, Stamford Park there on the left, beautiful Victorian park. Even the water system was so important in terms of putting cholera down and all the other typhoid diseases that were going on at the time. That's Dovestones Reservoir. Some of you might have been lucky to visit, on the edge of Saddleworth Moor, which Robert headed up the building of, so it would feed clean water to the people in the town. And the reservoirs were just, well, I'm sure you know, were absolutely fantastic structures of architecture. But Robert was fantastic on the home front, but he had an eye on the international front, which is the bit that fascinates me most of all, really. So he lived through these incredibly turbulent times, but he knew what was going on internationally. So he had 11 kids, and I always make the mistake of saying, and he brought up 11 children, and somebody, no, he didn't. His wife brought up 11 children. He was being a magistrate and being a councillor and trading tea. But he had 11 children in a tiny little shop, and this very, very full civic and legal life. And he was fascinated with local politics. He was very pro-Disraeli, conservative and anti-Gladstone. But he had this eye on the international. Bear in mind, he lived through the Crimean War. He lived through the situation in Ireland, what was happening in India in the 1850s and the 1860s, and the Civil War. There's even a statue to Lincoln in Manchester who wrote to the people of Manchester to thank them for the sacrifices that they made, because they identified with the lot of the slaves. They were suffering, they were starving for 3 years, they were going without, and yet they somehow identified and they went without to support the liberation of the slaves in America. And I just think that's incredible. How many people today would actually make sacrifices for somebody on the other side of the world that they'd never met? And the thing that Robert was really interested in was the situation in the Balkans. He was very suspicious of Russia if you read his writings. But in 1876, into his second term as being elected as mayor, he hit national controversy. He was even mentioned in Parliament as being a dreadful mayor because he had refused to call a public meeting. There'd been a massacre of Christians by the Ottoman army in the Balkans. It's called the Bulgarian atrocities. It was horrific. And basically Gladstone said, everybody needs to call a mayor. Everyone needs to call a meeting. Across the land, we need meeting after meeting to condemn this, to condemn this. Robert said, no, I'm not calling a meeting. Of course it was wrong. We've put procedures in place to stop it. You are doing this for political reasons, and I'm not going to call a meeting. Of course I condemn it, but I'm not going to have a big public hoo-ha about it. And that really put the cat amongst the pigeons. How dare he? Who does he think he is? And he says to Quilliam in that interview, it was a really difficult time for me. Friends that I'd had until that point suddenly turned against me. And I never really looked, I don't think I ever really concentrated on that bit until I started researching what was going on. And then I found the original newspaper reports. So there was a meeting to call about the lack of a meeting, And it was, you couldn't make this up. They were calling meetings about not having meetings. And they were all criticising Robert. But the bit that I talk about in the book quite a lot is the language was a shocker to me. The anti-Muslim rhetoric. And it almost felt like this was clearly having a pop at the Ottoman Empire on the part of Gladstone. And he wasn't going to do it because he already was thinking, there's something here that I don't trust this government, I don't trust this politics, and I'm not going to play into their hands. That's what was going on in his mind. And it was that bad in Stalybridge when they called this meeting about how dreadful Robert was and who does he think he is. There was a vicar there who stood up to talk against Robert, and somebody attacked him, and the poor guy was on crutches, and you know, it was just crazy what was going on, the amount of anger, but the words that we used about not so much the Ottomans, it was constantly against Muslims. And it's really fascinating reading that the words, you know, the only good Muslim is a dead one kind of stuff, to paraphrase it. That's what was being said. So he decided to step down 2 months later as the mayor. And as you do, he decided, I'm going to go and own a pub now. And he owned a pub for 18 years. The pub's still there. It's called the New Inn in Ashton. And he was a publican. Nothing more of that period to find other than the fact that he owned that pub for 18 years. And then, this is the interesting bit, he decided to move to Rusholme in Manchester. And he sold up. And that's the row of houses that he lived in. Thankfully, we managed to find that photograph. And he moved at the age of 69. And the fascinating bit was knowing a little bit about that side of Manchester. I clocked that Emmeline Pankhurst lived just round the corner. And then thinking, well, Robert's really well known. He's going to know Emmeline. Surely he's going to know Emmeline. And I just had this strange feeling. So when I sent off for Robert's wife, my great-great-granny's death certificate, lo and behold, Emmeline Pankhurst signed it. She was a registrar for the area. So she'd obviously met Robert, who registered the death. I think they probably knew each other. I've got no evidence of it, but I put that into the second book because I think that would have been so fascinating. She would have found him a really interesting person. Because he converted. So he converted to Islam just after he sold the pub. He sold the pub first, and he moved to Manchester, and he was in Manchester when he decided, I'm going to become a Muslim. And I think it was very much a gradual change at the age of 69. This is the narrative that he told Quilliam. He told this is what I love about Robert. Everything's really logical. A bit like Quilliam, really. Everything's really logical, really kind of like, you know, the whole manly rhetoric. There's no emotion in it whatsoever. It's all very logical progression here. And this is what he says. He met David Urquhart. And I do think David Urquhart, he needs some research onto him. Please, folks, do some research on him because he was an amazing person. He was sent off to Turkey, basically, you know, to do the dirty on the government there. And he came back as, wow, you know, this is an amazing place. The Caliph is fantastic. And he never became a Muslim himself, but he spent the rest of his life trying to right the wrongs against the Ottoman Empire. And he set up these things called foreign affairs committees, which were dotted across the country. And when I researched into them, I found that there was one in Stalybridge. Robert said he'd met him. So Robert was clearly part of this little committee of know-it-alls, as the local people called them. And they should spend more time worrying about our local area, not foreign things overseas. And so that made him think a lot. And he met somebody who was clearly sort of feeding his interest in these international affairs. So he decided from the pub, this is the bit I love, he started writing letters. He started writing letters to the government. He started lobbying the government on the treatment of Muslims overseas, in the Balkans, in Armenia, in Afghanistan, in Bulgaria. And this is the best bit of all, corresponding with the Sultan, writing letters to the Caliph. Who does he think he is? He wrote him a letter, which is in the Crescent. You can find all of Robert's letters in the Crescent, saying, how can I, this is 3 years before he became a Muslim, he's writing to Quilliam, how can I possibly understand your religion if the only copy of the Quran that I've read is written by a Christian? That's going to be a little bit biased, isn't it? Please, Your Royal Highness, could we have a translation in English by a Muslim? A few years later, along comes the Pictorial translation, which you all know and love. And they gave him advice on trade, he gave him advice on manufacturing, he was sending him letters about soil content and advising that the young people of Turkey should go off to the German agricultural schools so they can grow better crops, feed the army better. And this the Sultan did. I mean, I don't know, it would be wonderful to find out what he thought of the man writing from the pub in Britain, giving him advice, even military advice. It's just a strange thing to imagine. But his role in influencing parliamentary reform as well has been, talked about a little bit about. And he was very proud of these things, quite rightly so. I think Quilliam probably took this interview as a way of trying to explain later on that very sensible people were becoming Muslims. It wasn't just a bunch of crackpots who were interested in the Ottoman Empire. Here's a really sensible, nice, kind, very intelligent man, self-educated man. So here he is, William Abdullah Quilliam, who I'm sure you are all familiar with, the Sheikh al-Islam of the British Isles. Robert said Shahada 22nd of April 1898 in the presence of Quilliam. We've got to thank Quilliam for that because he was so fantastic. He logged every single thing that went on at the Liverpool Muslim Institute. So Robert became part of the Liverpool convert community. Names there that you probably find quite familiar. I won't talk too much about Lord Stanley of Alderley because everybody always thinks we're related. I actually think we've still got to do some research into this. Our family has always said, even before this came out, there was a connection to the Stanleys of Alderleys. And obviously Lord Stanley and Robert Stanley would have known each other, and imagine Robert probably joked that he was like the poorer member of the family. But the sad thing is, there's been hardly any work whatsoever on the working class converts. All the convert names that you'll know were very middle class people, very upper class people. All of them had travelled and been exposed to Islam overseas. Robert never left the country, which I just find amazing. One, he couldn't have afforded to. Two, I don't think his wife would have let him with 11 kids. 3, his civic and legal responsibilities. But he just somehow absorbed this, and it became incredibly important to him. And he clearly impressed Quilliam, who was 28 years younger than him, because Quilliam almost instantly decided to appoint him as vice chairman at the Liverpool Muslim Institute. So yeah, he was writing 3 years before he converted, and this is just a snippet of one of the letters that he wrote. He wrote to the Prime Minister of the time, basically saying that there's hypocrites and imposters condemning the Sultan, and people need to sort of start thinking for themselves. And I think that would have been a motto of Robert, think for yourselves. And here's another one I found quite amusing when he wrote to the chairman of the Anglo-Armenian Society. Your rearrangement of the provinces of the Turkish Empire is a masterpiece. In the event of the division taking place, I hope you will remember me, as I think I have as much right to a slice as any of the rest. That's a classic Stanley sarcasm coming out for you there. And I think Quilliam very much wanted to show, as I said earlier, that there's something very rational in Islam. There's something very rational in Robert's progression towards it. And he was always put at the top of the table whenever a VIP or a foreign dignitary. He's always, you look at this is the great thing about Quilliam, his records. You can even see who sat where amidst all the celebrations and the banquets. And Robert's always up there. He's a pretty old man by now. And this is a fantastic picture. A friend of mine who'd got to know this story sent me this wonderful WhatsApp. Where would we be without it? Isn't that Robert? And I looked at it. Wow, that's him. This is only the third photograph that we've got of him. This is something that Yahya Burt picked up and put it up. Sort of, he was trying to show the celebrations of Christmas. I'm sure you all know that Christmas was celebrated and there was a big party at the Liverpool Mosque. And there's Robert right in the middle wearing his fez. And it's a classic Quilliam staged post there, really. He's just trying to show really how multiracial Islam is, British Islam is. He's even got a little boy down there at the front, probably from one of the orphanages, we think. But again, it might be George, because from the research that I found looking at the census, Robert basically adopted one of his grandsons when his own grown-up son died. Little George came to live with him. That's about the right age for George. It might be, it might not. But this is a good thing about writing a book about imagination. You can put all that in there. So we get to 1911. He's lost his wife. They've been together a long time. They celebrated their golden anniversary the same year that he converted, and he died in 1911. And from that point on, we have 100 years of our family not knowing anything about him other than the fact that he'd been a mayor. We knew nothing about him whatsoever until Dad got that copy of the Crescent. This is the house that he died in. It's still there. I want a blue plaque on it. I will do my best to get a blue plaque on it. Tiny little 2-bed terrace. So, you know, he never got to the mansion stage of life, but he came back to Stalybridge to live a few miles back down the road. We found his grave, and this is the amazing bit. We never presumed it would be, we always thought it might be the old St George's that he went to before he became a Muslim, but it wasn't. It was another church down the road called St Paul's, and it's a family grave. So we don't know anything other than Robert was buried there, and then a month later, it was destroyed. A month after my dad found the grave, the church had it, that entire section of the churchyard car parked, became a car park. So Robert is under a car park. We asked, could we keep the headstone, and we were told no, because we should have applied so many months before, but we'd only just found out. We will pay to have that. Nope, it's gone. Unfortunately, it's gone, but we've got the photograph of it there. So we have questions remaining, and I've tried to answer as many of them as I can, as objectively as I can in both of the books. The photograph there of the family there, that's some of his children, and the littlest one there, I think she's probably about 15 or 16 there. So yeah, those images have come to life very much in imagining Robert. So this is after his conversion. When people say, did his children convert, did his wife convert? I can only say I presume not, because there is no evidence otherwise, because we didn't even know that he was a Muslim, because everybody covered it up. That's my grandpa there with his wife Bertha, and we found, if you look very, very closely, you probably can't see from where you're sitting, that little pin, he's wearing that. They're both in mourning. So that's taken just after we put the timeline together, figured out that's just after Robert's died, his granddad's died. He's just got married to his new wife, and they're both in mourning, and he's wearing the crescent pin there. But everything changes from that point. The only thing that we knew just before my gran died, she obviously knew about my brother becoming a Muslim. She's absolutely fine with it. She's got, you know, wonderful great grandchildren, but she knew nothing about this. And we said to you, what did you ever hear about him? What did you know about him? She said, all I knew was he was a Rechabite, and I'd never heard of that term. And it basically means there's a biblical reference to people who abstained from alcohol. And obviously the temperance movement was massive at the time. So it could well be that that was the spin that the family put on it, you know, just say he didn't drink. And it's true, he didn't drink, I imagine, I don't know. He probably didn't drink, and that's probably what the spin that they put on it. So he was probably someone who owned a pub for 18 years. This is the narrative being reframed. He owned a pub for 18 years and he decided alcohol was a bad thing, so he gave it up. End of, let's not talk about it anymore. At this time in history, 1911, there was actually less religious tolerance than in the preceding 100 years. So it was okay to be a communist now. It was okay to be a socialist. It was okay to be an anarchist even. But it was not okay to do religion a little bit differently. And that's because you can see, if you actually look at the records of what was happening in the Liverpool Mosque, there were still attacks. Fatima Cates, I'm sure some of you know the name of Fatima Cates. Fatima would have known Robert, and she, you know, was, as a white, the first recorded white convert to Islam that we know of, had her face rubbed in horse dung on 2 occasions by local youths. Just the attacks on the Muslims were horrible. And these are only the recorded ones, not the ones that weren't recorded. But the big thing that happened was the outbreak of World War I. The big thing that happened was the Ottoman Empire, who Robert and Quilliam were so close to and were such good friends with and were such advocates of, sided with Germany. So at that point, somewhere like Staler Bridge, you are not going to put your head above the parapet and say, oh yeah, Robert, he was great, wasn't he? Oh yeah, they're allies with Germany now. It was just, shh, keep it quiet. That's the theory anyway. But he also, we know all of the converts of Liverpool would have been people of interest to the British intelligence agencies. So whilst we don't have any evidence for this, we know that Quilliam was. We know that all the other big convert names. Robert was very well known. He would probably have been, after the death of Lord Stanley, very much the grandfather of British Islam. And I don't think his family would have particularly welcomed that kind of interest in their lives. So once he'd passed away, it was, let's just forget about that. Let's remember the nice bit about him being a mayor and wasn't that great. But the other thing that we've recently discovered, which is fascinating, Bertha here, is related to her brother, married a woman called Dorothy Lawrence, who was closely related to T. Lawrence of Arabia, who was on the other side of it, really. So he was the hero in World War I. He was the one fighting the Turks. And so I think as well, even from her side, it would have been kind of like, let's not talk about that side because they're a bit out of favour at the moment. And it's just so really strange that on this side of the family, we've suddenly stumbled across the Lawrence of Arabia connection, which is just goes to show you, once you start digging into your family, you just don't know what you're going to find. So this is a quick photograph of family today. My brother there in the middle, my dad wearing the fez, and my 2 gigantic nephews there on the left. That's in the mosque in Liverpool, at the Quilliam Mosque. just to say as well, the reactions, every time I tell this story, I really love to see the reactions of people. And this was a young lad, he was 12. I did a talk in Cheetahville, and he was just so outraged about what had happened to Robert's grave that he went away and wrote a poem and mocked up a headstone. And I just thought, oh, if I could get that up there, that's fantastic. And he's even woven into it the meaning of the name Reschid. And that's just a wonderful example, I think, of how Robert's life and times can speak to somebody today. You know, the average 12-year-old, you think, well, they wouldn't be interested in that, but they are, because this is an amazing person, an ordinary person who's quite rightly, people are hearing about his life now. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. Having written the books, I'm going to do talks, I'm going to do workshops, trying to get people to think about their own hidden histories, maybe secrets, using Robert as an example of how a family and how communities can come together and learn about the truth of somebody who made such an amazing decision in his life, and to encourage people to dig into the true history of British Islam and not just the versions that we are being presented with in the past, the versions that are developing today. There is so much more research that we're doing with a strange collective of community historians and academics. We're working together from all different backgrounds to try and get a bit more truth out there. And I'm so pleased as well that the Arts Council are going to fund this to become a play. So during the summer, I'm working with a wonderful playwright who has got a vast amount of experience to turn this Robert story into a production that can get out there and show people from a very humane way of doing it. Screen would be wonderful, radio would be wonderful, but at the moment we kind of think getting people together in a room rather than this is probably the way forward for it. And I've just been asked to be writer in residence for Kirklees. I'm not quite sure why. I think they've taken leave of their senses, but it's going to be fantastic because they were so supportive of this, and I think they realised just the truth of the story and what it can mean to people. So hopefully I'll be able to do a little bit more over the next year in telling people about Robert's story. So if you do know anybody that wants to come to a talk, on the website there's a lot of dates there coming over the next year. In between that I'll try and struggle along writing a play and carry on doing what I do. And if you haven't seen the trailer, please do go and see the trailer, because my dad stars in it. My dad is really, really not excited about talking in public. He's a very shy person, but he is the most wonderful silent movie actor ever. And our friends at Arakan Creative Media who did the film Frasier, if any of you have got to see Frasier, it's about Islamophobia, it's set in Bradford. And Connor said he wanted to film a very short promotional trailer for the books, really, and it stars Dad dressed as Robert Reschid at the British Muslim Heritage Centre in Manchester. So please do have a look at that. And thank you for listening to a very quick potted history of a man. If you've got any questions at this time.
Can I just ask you why you wrote 2 books?
Well, I've written both non-fiction history before and fiction. Yeah. So this book is really trying to draw out the hidden voices and the interesting characters. So Quilliam, everybody tries to imagine what Quilliam is like. They paint him to be this kind of person. And I wanted to bring out the humane aspects of him and the interaction with Robert, the friendship side of things, but also, you know, how Robert's wife would have reacted. You know, they're coming up to their golden anniversary and he goes and does something like this. So there's quite a lot of humour in it as well. And I've tried to bring to it my own experiences, my mum's experiences, the things that people said to us when they heard that my brother had converted. It would have been even harder in those days. So I've tried. That's a lot more imaginative, and that came really fast. That book that was fantastically easy to write. This one, again, you know, I wouldn't describe myself as an academic, but I wanted to do it academic justice. So that's a very, very non-fiction read, really. So if you like your history and you like your facts, that's that one. But 2 sides of the story, and I guess what I like to do is, I know that people learn stories in very different ways. So what I want to do is tell Robert's story in as many different ways as possible to reach as many people, because there's a lot of people who need, sorry that sounds really arrogant, but they need to know this story, and they will not pick up a non-fic book that's quite academic, and they might not pick up a book at all, but we can get it out to them as a play or as a radio drama. So, and yeah, I just like writing. Thank you. Yeah?
A fascinating story. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
In his magistrate role, did he stay in that role during? Because I might have missed it when he converted. Did he stay in that?
Yeah,
role?
he did. Yeah, when he moved to Manchester, he basically couldn't act as a magistrate anymore. But as far as I'm aware, it was nothing to do with his conversion, but it was because he was living outside of the boundary. So as soon as he moved, so yeah, I mean, he was still accepted as a JP. So when, for example, Quilliam writes about him, he always still says JP. He still is a JP, but he's not practicing. And it was quite funny because Quilliam likes to describe Robert as being a mayor, and whenever Robert writes, he writes ex-mayor, so he's quite, pernickety about it. I don't think he wanted to claim something that he wasn't anymore. But yeah, he was still known as a magistrate, as a justice of the peace. Thank you.
And were there any places of worship in his area, or did he go to the church?
Well, Sadiq Seddon, who we've known for a long time, and he's really pushed us to get this story out in book format, he's done some brilliant research in the Manchester area, so with the Alaska community in particular, and exactly at that place where Robert moved to, we think was the first mosque, which was in a terraced house basically in the 1920s. That's the first evidence that we've got, but we do know that there was Muslim communities there, merchants mainly, who Robert would have known from the corn exchange, but also there was, fascinatingly, there was a Jewish and Muslim Hebrew school at that part of Manchester as well. So that particular bit around the Victoria Park area of Rusholme was quite well known for that kind of community. So I think that's why he moved there. He had an adult son just living around the corner as well, who worked with him on the tea trading side of the business. So it would have been quite a logical place to move to. And if by then, he was practicing being a Muslim, eating halal food, there were lots of halal food shops in that part of Manchester as well, which there weren't back in Stalybridge and Ashton. Certainly once the Christian Israelite community shrank, you could have had kosher food, but those shops weren't there anymore. So it was in many ways a logical place to move as well, because he would have been closer on the train line to Liverpool. And I just think, in his 70s, getting on that train in the Victorian period, he must have been quite a tough person. Thank you. Any more questions? Yep.
Thank you so much for the
Thank you.
presentation. I was wondering, after he became a Muslim, was he ever involved in the arts of writing poetry? He was evidently a very capable writer, and he liked writing letters to people around the world. So I'm interested in the artistic interventions, particularly because of the very interesting point you made about him coming from a working class background as opposed to some of the other Muslims at the time.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
Well, I've always been interested in things like the Mechanics Institute and working class education, the libraries. A lot of the work that I do is about promoting libraries. So I kind of feel that that's how he educated himself. I think he would have, I don't know who would have taught him to read and write, maybe Uncle John or a friend of Uncle John did. But poetry was so common in those days. And we found one poem in the Crescent by Robert. And it's amazing because I'm not sure, Quilliam printed a lot of poems and he wrote a lot of poems under pseudonyms himself. But this poem by Robert is nothing at all to do with Islam, and it's nothing to do with mushy love stuff, which was often in the pages of the Crescent as well. It was about he refers to his cousin. It's a very short 2-verse poem, who'd come to visit from America. And it's a really lovely poem. We think, looking at the family history from the names involved, it was actually his niece, but that was quite a common way of referring to your niece was as your cousin. And it was just basically celebrating seeing her again after such a long time, and that blood ties are so important is what he says in it. So I do think that they must have written more. I've never been able to find them in the page of the Crescent, not in his name, unless he used a pseudonym, which he might have done. But again, family never kept these kind of things. We do have a tiny little birthday book, which I've found, now that I've got evidence of his handwriting, I've been able to see, this is from the 1850s on, tiny little thing. And I've seen evidence of his handwriting. And also in it, there's little snippings from newspaper of poems. Some of them with the name of the poet on them and others not. So it could well even be that he wrote some of these and he sent them off to the newspaper, because every single newspaper of the time has got amateur poets writing to them. But it's such a shame that nothing like that was ever kept. But again, it's taken me till my 40s to actually to be able to say, I can write books, I want to write books. Because from my background, you don't do that. So, that's the interesting thing, is in those days you could do that and you were encouraged to do that. Especially if you hadn't gone to school, it was a wonderful thing to be able to write a poem. Whereas now it's almost the opposite. It's who do you think you are kind of thing. Hopefully we can change that. But yeah, if anybody wants to do research into finding Robert's poems, I would be very grateful. Thank you. Thanks. The other thing I would say as well is the thing that is really important to me is to get this book into libraries. Now, Cube, bless Cube, have decided to distribute it. I was so excited that they saw this book and they wanted to distribute it, so they're doing that. But it's down to an individual to get it into a library. So if you want your local library to have it, all that you need to do is, I think you just fill a form in and say, please order this book in. Because I just want people to read it who can't afford to buy a book. There's too much big companies in the world making money out of selling books online, which we all do, but there are still people out there who would come across it in a library that would never discover it online. So if you can nominate it, that would be great. And thank you so much for your time. Oh, sorry, one more question.
Yeah, sorry. You're obviously very enthusiastic about sort of Robert. I mean, have other people shared their enthusiasm, or some people struggled with what you've uncovered about Robert?
Yeah, I mean, most people probably wouldn't be so rude as to say it to my face, but I have had quite a few very unkind comments online, because it's just where the keyboard warriors are the best and at the bravest. And, you know, I think some people quite rightly say, well, you don't have any proof that he didn't renounce his faith. I don't have any proof of that. I don't have any proof of anything of that sort. Quilliam, interestingly, was in Preston at the time. He fled overseas, which is, again, I could talk about that forever, but he went overseas. They had the Young Turk Rebellion, and then he came back. So he was back in Preston, just down the road from Robert at the time that Robert died. So I don't know how Robert's life ended, and I'm absolutely happy to talk about that. But yeah, there have been people that have accused my family of trying to Islamify Britain. You know, oh, everything's got to be Muslim these days. Oh, you know, you can imagine the kind of chunnerings. But you know, my dad in particular, he's got no axe to ground. My dad's an agnostic, an atheist. I don't quite know how he'd describe himself, but he's just interested in telling the truth of a story, as it is, as far as we can do. I'm very proud of the person that Robert was, but there are people absolutely that don't like the fact that we feel good about this story. Thank you.
I'm gonna ask about the sort of on the imagining, filling elements of sort of what he's going through. Have you explored his sort of spiritual kind of journey? So like, I can see, okay, he's, you know, he has, as a magistrate, and he wants, you know, justice for the working class, this, that kind of stuff. But that's like sort of for people. But then like his sort of internal element, in his connection to God, and then the Christian Israelites and stuff. So it's like he's obviously in some kind of Unitarian kind of environment. Very interesting choice of words, because
Uncle John Stanley's family are buried in the Unitarian chapel in Duckenfield. The Unitarians were massive. I talk about this a lot in the opening chapters. They were huge in Duckenfield, Stalybridge area. It was a huge practice. So I do think the family already had connections. So we've got the Christian Israelite connections and the Unitarian connections. He happened to worship at the Church of England because it was nearest, and that was the way you go into politics in Stalybridge at the time. But there's nothing written down about his personal relationship with God at all. And it's almost like, in a way, in that interview with Quilliam's deliberately led him away from that. So he talks about very logical achievements in his life. So there isn't anything in terms of his own spiritual beliefs. The only thing that I could find, which is when he was made mayor, they still have it in some parts of Britain today, called churching the mayor, although they don't call it that anymore. I think it's they usually have like an interfaith ceremony now, but there are probably some areas that do the churching. So they churched him. He went to church in a massive big procession, and the vicar does a huge big sermon, and then the mayor gets to speak, the newly elected mayor. And interestingly, sectarian Stalybridge, the vicar basically trashes all the other denominations in his sermon, and then Robert steps up, completely undoes it in a really nice sort of quiet way, and sort of says, if only everybody went to church, basically, it doesn't matter which church you go to, I would be seeing less people in court. And that's the only bit that I can ever get from. And he was a Christian. He actually said, I am a Christian mayor. And that's at a time he was a Christian. So he was showing then, I think, that he wasn't sectarian in his beliefs. And if you read that versus what the vicar had just said, it was almost undermining what the vicar was saying in a way. But that's the only thing I've ever found. I've never found anything more you know, so it's quite again, I feel like I'm giving a very sort of political, logical illustration of his journey rather than a very personal, spiritual one. I'd love to find out more.
Yeah, because I would wonder, like, so maybe, you know, even him being a Muslim later on, whether he would still say, I'm a Christian, is all in you know, some sort of taking Christianity as like the same religion, it's the same thing, it's
Yeah.
you know, so it's like that kind of thing as well, to make yourself normal.
Yeah.
And perhaps that, because it's like if the family are then Christians and he's not, kind of, you must become, you know, there's this whole thing, so clearly it's not just, you know, protection from the intelligence agency, why they don't suddenly have Muslim names or something like that, you know, it's clearly this.
I think he was such an original thinker, and I think he was, if you tested our DNA, there would be a stubbornness in it. And I speak for everybody in my family, but I think he would have just drank up the learning that he accumulated throughout his life and from Quilliam, and kind of done his own thing. So when people say, well, why did he have a Christian burial? Apart from the fact that he was probably tight and said, well, we've paid for it, I'm going in that grave anyway, his wife was there. Why would he go to Liverpool? You know, that's the way he would have thought. We've got the family grave there. My baby son's in that grave. Why would I want to be separate from them? We have so much in common. Why would I need to be separate? That's that's my personal sort of portrayal of how I think he might have thought. But I think you're onto something there. I think he kind of was quite unique. He was probably quite alone. Certainly in the last couple of years of his life, after Quilliam had left the country and he'd come back to stay at the bridge, I think he would have just practiced it quietly in his own way. And then it might have suited his family purpose just to put a lid on it. We don't talk about things like that in our family, but we do now. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, everybody.
I think that's all we have time for, but thank you so much, Christina. That was fascinating. And I think there's copies of the books that everyone can purchase and maybe get her to sign if you like. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cambridge Muslim College, training the next generation of Muslim thinkers.